How's it going? Plant Fan Club here with another deck profile. This time I'm going to be taking a look at a big yellow Lilina build that I made a couple days ago. I think it's in a pretty good spot in the meta, and I've honestly just been having a ton of fun playing it. It's like a pretty good hybrid between control and mid-range, due to sort of running both the typical Lilina engine and the big yellow engine. And I've been having a ton of fun with it, and I wanted to, just share it and, let other people see what the list is looking like. So, for a bit of history, Lilina was a pretty hyped up card in set 21 when she was released. She's got 3 really good skills. First skill lets her discard a card to plus 30 herself until the end of the opponent's next turn. Second skill lets her draw a card for destroying any enemy as long as she used the first skill. And then if she's got 150 attack, she can flip one to just blow up board, including main character, which is really, really strong. So a lot of people played a very aggro Lilina build that just looked to put on a ton of pressure, be 90 base as often as possible, draw a bunch of cards off her second skill, and basically say, look, you need a ton of evades or I'm just going to keep blowing you up. The problem with that build is that it wasn't as good into the long game. So if your opponent had a lot of dodges, then Lilina kind of doesn't do a lot. You -1 to not draw a card, which feels kind of bad. And let's see, any anti-destruction effect kind of turns off her other skill. I think H.R. Roy was released either in this set or the previous set, so he was a pretty... I think people were running him pretty frequently, because this was before set 22 Roy. And then any deck that can still hit her after the 90 buff was pretty bad as well. Because of her skill requiring copies of MC, she selfed a lot, so anything that can kind of hit 90 with supports was doing pretty alright into her. And anything that ran extra dodges. I remember I ran a Obro deck into Lilina. This was before we were running Unlim, and I just kind of had dodges for my board, and she never drew cards and then died because I just crit her to death, right? It worked out pretty well. Lilina kind of was stifled on cards, and then it, didn't go too well. So another version of Lilina that actually saw a lot more success was Tabarn's Overclass Lilina build. This one actually took a tournament set off of me back, I think, in set 21 release tournament, actually. This one used Lilina's card draw engine and self buff to kind of A, clear board while drawing cards for it, and B, tank up and survive into the late game. And once he was in the late game, he used stuff like Jenny and Delthea to sort of get ahead on advantage in a way that that a lot of other decks can't really afford to play against, right? So Lilina was pretty good at stalling out, and then you also just have that flip one as a panic button option. If you need to clear a super threatening board that you can't deal with any other way, you can always just pitch some evades and blow up, right? So a lot of ways people have built Lilina. I think some of the more popular ways right now are a Dancer build that runs cards like Nils to just buff Lilina by 30, and Azura, which buffs Lilina by 30 when she attacks. Or after she attacks, you can untap her and buff her by 30, which is, super good. That gets you to the 150 threshold. Ton of other ways to do it. But the card that I thought of that, when you're thinking of Lilina, you're thinking of, okay, I want to get to a plus 30 threshold. I want to, buff myself a lot to get to that 150. The newest card that really does that is Sigurd. When you think about plus 30, you think about Sigurd. So I was like, all right, let's throw together a yellow list with Lilina and see what that looks like. And through testing and like a bit of playing, I've found that this deck actually does pretty good. I mentioned that it is a mid-range to control build because for the most part, you're not actually looking to hit your opponent. You're playing a lot like a typical big yellow control deck, like Deirdre, Julia, Lysithea. But because of your inherent draw engine and the ability to just, snap your finger, blow up a board, you can kind of play a little bit more mid-range and afford to attack a lot earlier. I know that a lot of people are looking to get into control. I've taught a bunch of people lately how to pilot control decks, and especially how to win with control decks, because one of the toughest parts is getting your win condition down. And I think this is actually a really, really good deck to teach that as well. It plays like a control deck, so you learn a lot of the same lines, but because Lilina tends to be a lot safer of an MC, she's not as squishy as Deirdre, since she can buff herself starting as early as turn 3, and can run, or at least wants to run more evades. Your win condition comes a lot sooner, if that kind of makes sense. So this is the deck that I wanted to make a sort of quick overview of the list that I threw together, and sort of walk people through it, see how it looks, and maybe encourage people to give the deck a try. I know Lilina hasn't seen a lot of success lately, but I think this deck does pretty good into the current meta. I think she's got a lot of stuff going for her, so let's take a look at the list. Obviously, we'll just get over real quick. We're running this Lilina. You know, during your opponent's turn, she's a 40 base. Sweet. You want to live until late game? This is the one that you're going to use. No questions there. Easy. And so, yeah, this is what the list looks like. We're running 16 Lilina, 8 Nino, and then a bunch of yellow cards. The yellow package is going to be pretty standard. There's a few things you might notice that are a little bit different than what Big Yellow normally runs, but I'll get to that a little bit later. We're running the 16 Lilinas. I think you could actually get away with running less. I wouldn't run any less than 15, but if you wanted to cut a Lilina to make room maybe for another Sigurd or something, a fourth Nanna, I probably wouldn't do that, but, you know, there is a bit of flexibility there in the total Lilina count. You could maybe go down to 15, as long as your draw engine is effective. So what I'm going to do here, I'll kind of go over the non-Lilina inclusions that I have, and then discuss some of the cards that got cut. And then I'll also go over some cards that you can consider adding yourself, that might improve the deck. There are cards that I just haven't had a chance to test, or, you know, maybe just weren't good enough to make the cut. I think, for example, a card you're like, what? Where is he? Eliwood. I played with him a bunch, and he just was underperforming, so I made room for other cards. So one of, I think, the most important cards in any Lilina deck is Nino 4. If you go promote on 3, Nino on 4, you're feeling pretty good that game, because Nino gets you more dodges. Nino lets you stack cards like Nino. She stacks this Lilina as well, potentially. You can also do a bunch of other kind of crazy plays too. For example, if you've got a Sigurd lined up, but your hand is kind of clogged up with, like, I don't know, Leifs, Selifs, or whatever, like any bond skill that you want to activate, you can stack it on top with Nino, as the cost of your grabbing a dodge back. And then set up for the next turn, turn 5, you can say, all right, sweet, now I've got myself in the retreat for Sigurd. Awesome, we can class change him then, right? Another combo that is similar, but, you know, a later game combo is you can do the same thing, but instead of stacking like something to be discarded, you can stack it and then use Deirdre to ramp that card into your bonds. So if you want to maybe put a Leaf in your bonds, you can stack it with Nino, grab a Lilina back, flip a bond to put the Leaf back in your bonds instead of throwing it in the discard. Tons of really, really good plays you can make with Nino. She is one of the most important cards for your deck. If you have a Nino on the board, and any cards in your hand, you are going to be able to make Lilina a 90 base, and you are going to be able to threaten that card draw. Super important. So yeah, something to be considering. Something that I probably should have mentioned a little bit earlier, right, is that your goal with this deck is to sit at a 90 base as long as possible. Potentially 120 base. You really don't want to. But, you know, some decks are scary. They're going to hit you at 90 with a lot of dudes. You just kind of have to say, all right, we're going to have to tank up a little bit more and hopefully accelerate our game plan. But for the most part, you're going to be, at least in the early game, until once you get to about the late game, so once you hit like your 8 bond turn, you are basically just going to be buffing Lilina, whether with her own ability or with Sigurd, and then just clearing board and drawing a card for doing it. That is basically what your game plan is. With Lilina, at least, right? what you are building towards is pretty important too. So if you're just clearing board, you're not winning the game, right? You're denying your opponent cards by not giving them orbs, but you're not moving yourself closer to winning the game. So like every other big yellow deck, your win condition is going to be Seliph 5. You're going to want to build towards a very big Holy War's end. So typically your 8-bond turn is going to be when you're looking to start using Seliph's Holy War. There are a ton of ways you can line that play up. But before I start getting into that, let's talk a little bit more about how you're going to get there. Your main way of doing that is going to be Deirdre. I think she is one of your best turn 4 plays. I think if you've got Nino and Deirdre in your hand, it's a pretty tough call as to whether you're going to play Nino or Deirdre. What you really want to be doing is ramping as quickly as possible. Basically, adding more bonds to your bond area instead of just your once per turn kind of deal. One of the downsides of this deck is that your early game is very fair. If you are playing against a purple deck that is hitting Keats against you, and you're getting out ramped, like if their turn 5 comes on at the same time as your turn 3, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. So you have to be, there isn't really much you can do with this list exactly, like the list that I've got right here, but you have to make up for, other players' unfair early games, by having a unfair sort of mid to late game. And Deirdre is going to be the card that's going to let you start to do that. Ramping up, basically, let's see, your turn 4 play. Turn 4, you play Deirdre, you ramp. The next turn, you're going to go in and have 6 bonds. If Deirdre survives, you ramp again to 7. And on that turn, if Deirdre survived and you're deploying something else, you might be deploying a Sigurd, you might be deploying a Nanna. So you could, in theory, I think, I'll do the math on this, right? You're at 4, play Deirdre, ramp to 5. Next turn, you bond up to 6, play Sigurd, get up to 7, ramp again with Deirdre, you're at 8. That's the number that you're looking to hit. You can't, what I was thinking was like whether you can deploy Leif on that turn, and I don't think you can. But either way, you're going to be getting up to a lot of bonds. Sigurd is another play that you can do to ramp. He's a turn 4 that ramps you a card and, lets you flip to buff your MC. I actually don't think flipping to buff your MC at that point in the game is as good. If your turn 4 comes first, I think the benefit is if your opponent class changes their MC and doesn't deploy anything else, and you don't want to hit them with Lilina to get your card draw, you could keep the dodge in hand and instead, on your turn 4, Sigurd buff, and then just pass instead of using Lilina's Armads. That is a potential play that you can make. That's something that Sigurd is good for there too, if you want to play it a little bit more slowly. But I actually don't think he's as essential to the deck. Lilina is able to buff herself pretty consistently, especially with Nino, and especially if you're like prioritizing targeting your opponent's cards that are the least likely to have evades, and you just keep drawing off of that, you're going to be in a really good spot and probably won't need to Sigurd as much. So I actually am running less of him to make room for other essential cards. So another difference that you see with this list from other big yellow lists is that I'm running 3 Nanna. Usually Nanna is like a 1 or 2 of, but in this deck, you're actually looking to deploy Nanna, potentially. So if your turn 4 is Nino, you can go turn 5, bond again, and then play Nanna, ramp up to 7. On your next turn, you're at 8, which is, that magic number that you're looking to hit. So Nanna is actually a really good deploy, partly because this deck doesn't actually spend bonds that well. So a lot of decks, that's going to be a downside. But I think it's kind of not the worst because it allows you to actually deploy Nanna and use her ramp skill. For the most part, in big yellow decks, Nanna is not hitting the board unless you're unifying to close out the game. But being able to sort of look at Nanna as a potential deploy that gets you a lot of value, I think is really, really good. And I think that's a benefit of Lilina. Because I think one of the differences that I noted was that Lysithea, for example, is a brown big yellow MC that sort of does something similar to Lilina, where your goal is to just draw a card each turn, but instead of discarding a card as the cost, like Lilina is, Lysithea has to flip 1. So she can't afford to Nanna, especially because Lysithia's skill requires you to have brown bonds, which is a little bit tougher. So I think actually having an MC that doesn't actually rely on flipping bonds to generate value is really, really good here, because it enables you to just use Deirdre and Nanna and potentially ramp face down bonds and not really care that much, because your win con is just putting them in your hand anyway with Seliph. So looking ahead, I guess since I already touched on that, let's talk a little bit more about your bond spenders for this deck. I am actually running Nino. So when I mentioned I cut Eliwood I actually cut to make room for Nino 1s. Nino is one of the best cards in your deck. Nino 4 is a really, really good card, right? So having A, dodges for Nino is really, really good, and then B, having Nino 1s to stack off of Nino's skill is also really, really good. Nino is a way to potentially flip your bonds. Whenever another ally is supported by Nino, you can just flip one, draw one. And that's, like, pretty darn good. Like, it's a way to flip your bonds that you normally don't have with this deck. And if you are doing it on offense, you can Nino, stack a Nino, Magic Emblem, you've supported a Nino, so you can flip one to draw another card, and then you basically just drawed 2, discarded 1, so you filtered your hand quite a bit, and in that interaction, you probably stacked it for Lilina, so you're drawing another card. You're basically drawing 3 cards off of that, and only discarding 1. It's really, really good. I think having those extra Ninos is a pretty strong move, and she's also good early game. Like, if you just play a Nino turn 1, that's really good, too. She filters your hand, which lets you sort of hit more inconsistent plays. So I actually made room for the Nino. I cut 2 Elliwoods and I cut a 1/1 Sigurd line, which is, you know, it hurts Sigurd's consistency. You want to make sure you have the pieces, but an early Nino can mitigate the downside of running less Sigurd as well, because she helps you filter to find those pieces. So maybe if you don't have a Deirdre, but you do have, you know, Sigurd 5, you can start fishing for a Sigurd 0. And if you hit a Deirdre, you say, sweet, I'll just discard the Sigurd now. So Deirdre is a ramp target that lets me, you know, not have to worry about that. The other bond spender that I have is Lana. Lana is a potentially very efficient bond spender by potentially just having flip 1, heal a yellow card. But normally the downside to Lana is that she's inefficient. It's flip 2 to heal 1, which feels kind of bad. But in this deck, where you don't actually have an efficient way to spend your bonds, having a little bit of inefficiency isn't the end of the world. You can afford to flip 2. And why Lana is important is because she grabs you your Seliph. So your win condition with this deck, as I mentioned before, is using Final Holy War and just grabbing a ton of your bonds back, grabbing a bunch of dodges, grabbing evades for MC, right? Dodges for board, crits, just whatever. You refill your hand with the best cards that are in your bonds and just go from there, right? Super, super good. That is the win con of most decks, and it's the win con that you're kind of building towards. In order to get to Seliph, you have Leif. Leif is probably... So this Leif is pretty standard. You've got your Unify... What is it? Unify Thracia, I think, right? Yeah, Unifier of Thracia, which is the typical big yellow sort of win condition, right? You Unify, just sort of dump a whole bunch of units on board when you have 12, right? I think once you've got 12 bonds, you can just dump 3 units and just have a huge turn. Unify is pretty good, but it's actually not as essential to this deck as the set 22 Leif is. I think this card is maybe one of the best cards in your deck, potentially better than Nino even. Maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, but he enables a ton of crazy plays. So you're also looking to get to your 8 bond turn so that Leif's skill 3 is active as well. Once you get to 8 bonds, something that you can look to do is, let's see, getting your Seliph down and also Holy Warring in the same turn. If you have, let's see, there's like a lot of ways that you can use this Leif to sort of like cheat a Seliph out and Holy War early. So for example, if you have a Seliph in your hand, but you've already like ramped a Seliph into your bonds, you just need to have 8 bonds, and this Leif can get you to a Unify right away. You just deploy him, flip one to deploy the Seliph that's in your hand, and then use his free bond grab to grab back the other Seliph. And then you've got your Holy War right there. I think also Nanna is a way to do that too. If you're at 9 bonds, you can use, and you have 2 Seliphs in your bond. So for example, maybe you've used Leif Seliph to unflip some bonds. Maybe you've ramped them in there with Sigurd. If you've got Leif and a Nanna and 9 bonds, you can start your turn or your bond phase by grabbing your Seliph back. Then you can deploy Leif, and bam, you're in the exact same position where you can just grab your second Seliph out of your bonds, flip one to deploy one, and you've got your Unify. Or not Unify, your Holy War, right? It is a pretty solid deck. You also have on turn 6, for example, so let's say if your play is Deirdre on 4, she ramps you up to 6. So if in your hand you have Leif Nanna, you can just deploy Leif and then flip one to deploy Nanna, flip 2, ramp a whole bunch. Now you're at 9 and you've got a super good turn coming up on the following turn. Like, you can make the play that I mentioned before, like assuming Leif sticks, and grab your Seliphs back that way. If Leif dies, you've got Lana as well. Ways to get him back, ways to get other things back. It's just a super versatile build that you've got there by running a lot of copies of this Leif. So then the other thing that I would mention is that Leif also gets you Sigurd, which is pretty sweet. Not a bad card there. If you need to just tank up for a turn, you can use Sigurd to spend your Seliph bonds, and then grab them back with Leif in the same play. There's just a lot of like moving pieces that you can do to sort of like buff your MC a bunch, or potentially get your Seliphs back to Holy War. So what are you doing after you get to the Holy War, you might ask, is you're sort of looking to grab back enough bonds that you can play another ramp card on the next turn. So for example, you've probably put a Nanna in your bonds once you're Holy Warring, so you're probably going to want to like grab back all the evades that you've ramped so far for Lilina, right? Maybe any other Seliphs that you've got there, maybe a Leif, but then if you've got a Nanna in your hand already, or a Deirdre, you can go down to 4 bonds if you've got Nanna, 3 bonds if you have Deirdre, and then just on your next turn, play a bond, play Nanna, ramp back up. You're at 7, I think, right? Yeah, you'd be at 7, and you can Holy War again on the next turn. Once you get to that point, it is pretty hard to lose the game, unless you've really gotten unlucky with Nanna or Deirdre ramping dodges into your bonds. Or like maybe your board just hasn't stuck. They're playing super aggro. You're just out of dodges. That's a very real possibility. But I think for the most part, once you get to that first Holy War, ramping back up on that following turn is going to be enough to let you just start saying, all right, we're swinging now. So you're probably going to want to look to try and swing with Leif first, right? Like it's just going to be typical like Unify finishes, right? If your play is to Unify for Seliph for your Holy War, then you're cooking because Leif has his double break already online. Alternatively, you can just kind of like, all right, I Holy Ward, I grab dodges for everything, I'm going to pass, and then next turn, class change into Leif, or just deploy him if he got cleared, and then, double break and just go from there. I've probably got a big enough board that you can't deal with without a board wipe, and, that's the point where you can start really, doing a lot of damage. I think what makes the Lina good into good here in terms of like being able to attack early is that that +1 that she gets from hitting anything means that it's not actually that unsafe to hit your opponent early, because you're not just giving them a card, you're also getting a card. And if they decide to dodge, then their hand is even worse for it, right? Normally they would want to start bonding dodges to kind of get... That's actually the other thing too, right? If you start not hitting them, they're going to start bonding dodges. And if they start bonding dodges, your go for game turn is going to be super good. So there's just a ton of really, really good options there. I'm pretty sure there's other stuff that I'm missing, but for the most part, I think that's a pretty good overview of how the deck actually functions. Some cards that I cut include Deirdre 1. I think in any deck that's looking to use Holy War, Deirdre 1 is a really, really good card because you can just throw a dodge in there. If you're missing like a Leif for the following turn, you can just heal a Leif using Deirdre and then, Holy War it. You can get your Selifs in bonds for Holy War to get back with like Leif later. There's a ton of really, really good plays that Deirdre 1 enables, but I did find her to just be a little bit too slow, and she tends to not stick, like not be, at least in the games that I've played, she wasn't a potential option late game because Deirdre ended up sticking. Since Deirdre isn't like a prime target when you're also playing like Leif and Seliph and Nino, Deirdre has a pretty good chance of just sticking. And if she does, then you can't get any value out of the Deirdre 1, so there's no point in playing for it. It's just sort of like a good early game card, but when you're in the early game, you don't have as many good targets for your bonds, so it just kind of ends up getting a little bit weird. I found her to be less effective, so I just cut her to make room for Nino, who is a better early play, right? Another card is Eliwood. I actually found that Eliwood's buff was never super relevant. There might be decks where having the +10 lets you fix math, but for the most part, the pull isn't actually that crucial. Lilina having 1 to 2 range and also being 90 base kind of just lets her clear whatever you're looking for. And there isn't really like a ton of concern there. I think one of the nice things about Eliwood is that you can stack him with Nino, and since you don't flip your bonds very efficiently, you can kind of use him to rearrange your opponent's board. But again, at the same time, I didn't actually think it was that essential. So he's sort of like a tech option, and I decided to cut him in favor of consistency, adding, again, the Ninos. I was running a 2 Deirdre, 2 Eliwood line, and I cut them both for the Nino. Other cards that I cut, I was originally running a 4/4 Sigurd line, and I made room for Lana instead. I think Lana's a really good card. She just kind of does a lot of things that Sigurd can't do, like just healing a Seliph 2-hand. Really, really good. Like Lana Seliph can just get you a Holy War if that's what your hand is, and that might be all you need to get your way back into the game. So I'm a big fan of Lana. She just enables a lot of plays, and I think since Sigurd didn't actually see a lot of play in the games that I played, or at least in the test games that I did, I think that's a pretty reasonable cut. You can make the argument again, like I think I mentioned earlier that you can potentially cut a Lilina and go down to 15. That might be a way to add another Sigurd. Another card that I'm looking at, another way to actually add another Sigurd if you're looking for it, most big yellow decks only run 1 to 2 Nanna. I decided to go with 3 because I think she's actually a pretty good deploy, unlike most big yellow decks. So I wanted to have more outs to having Nanna in your hand as an actual deploy. If you've got 2 Nanna in hand, that's much better than just having 1 because you can deploy her and also use her bond skill. Like, it's just more Nanna seems pretty good there. But you can always play a little bit greedier, maybe cut a Nanna and go back and like lean into the Sigurd and hopefully try and get your ramp that way. Trying to think of some other cards. Again, one of the issues with the deck is that you don't spend your bonds very effectively. So the suggestion of Tinne was brought up. Tinne being if you're not familiar, this card, whenever you bond her, you can flip 1 to draw a card. Good way to draw bonds. Good way to draw cards. It's good bond spending. But I decided on going with Nino instead because A, she helps fix your purple requirement to like promote on an early turn. And she also lets you draw cards by cycling, but also through Nino's support skill as well. I think she just does a lot more for the deck than Tinne does. She has utility as a dodge, as an early play, and as something else. Tinne isn't really ever going to hit the board, so I just decided that she wasn't going to be worth playing. And her being a 3 cost also coincides with your promo turn. Just kind of didn't seem like a card that fits into the curve, and didn't seem like a card that you're going to want to, that you're going to need to bond either. Like, there are ways to spend your bonds too. Trying to think. I wouldn't run any other Lilinas. I think 16 is a really good number. I found myself in every game that I played just base 90 every turn. It wasn't an issue. You might get unlucky here and there, but 16 is a really good number. 15 at the minimum. I was gonna say, if you do make a cut, I would actually cut the 1 copy of the 5/4 Lilina. Sure, she works with Nino, but Nino's the only card that can benefit from the support skill, and I'd rather just have the bridges as an anti-aggro kind of deterrent. So that's sort of the thought process there. Going into decks that this card or this deck does good against, right? I would say that any deck that kind of takes a while to set up itself, you're probably going to be doing well into. You have a lot of inherent value generation. I think one of the decks that I play tested against was Crom. And Crom just kind of took too long to get going, and by the time that it got going, I was able to just start clearing board, drawing cards for it, and eventually, I think like there was one turn where Crom had like a huge play. I lived it, and then I countered with a 4-blaze to just wipe the board, and that was pretty much the game at that point. Any deck that lets you live long enough to start building up your value, like any deck that lets you get to a Holy War, is probably going to be a matchup that you can potentially win. Unavoidables are a little bit scary because you're not running any Ore Peel. On the other hand, you do tank up and you do run a lot of dodges. I think one of the concerns would be like a crit-based deck. So Crit Seliph might be scary for this deck. I think Aboro is definitely scary for this deck because Aboro herself is going to be hitting you, and a lot of her units might just hit you because if you're defending for 90, you hit a Self and they hit a 40. I think like even the weenies are going to be hitting you. Like at least some of them are. So you could potentially run into a lot of trouble there. I think a lot of like early aggro decks are going to be this deck's downfall because you don't have that great of an early game. I think Nino to cycle isn't the best. You can hide behind her, but she doesn't actually do that much for you. You also don't want to bridge into those matchups, but your main promo doesn't really do anything except be a 40 base. So not the best. You also have a hard time clearing aggro units early game. Like you won't hit any of Hana's units. You won't hit you can hit Sword Boys, which is pretty good, but you might have a hard time hitting archers too, especially with yourselves. So kind of not the best. It's a little bit dicey in terms of the early aggro department. I don't know how Valois plays. You might be able to win a game. You might be able to win games against Valois. It's a matchup I didn't test, but again, you are big yellow. You can kind of like just say, all right, Vala, I'm going to clear your Silas every turn. You're going to have like maybe one turn where you just dump a huge board, but if I can respond by, clearing board, using 4-blaze, or even with Deirdre's, what's it called? Heiress to Naga's Blood, you might be totally fine against Vala. King Leo obviously hurts your deck a lot, but some cards like Azura isn't likely to hit your Sigurd because you don't run that many of them, and if she does hit Sigurd, it doesn't actually hurt your game plan that much, so you can kind of get away with like maybe doing alright in Vala. I think this deck could potentially take some games just by leaning more heavily into the big yellow kind of archetype and just playing for the late game and looking to just outvalue. You just have to be very careful because if Valois just has a turn where they copy King Leo and just goes off there, then you're going to be in some pretty bad trouble. It's not going to be the best. So you just have to kind of make sure you're playing around that and make sure you can recover from a turn like that. Zephiel is definitely a card you have to respect. I think purple is going to be a pretty rough matchup for this as well. I think I alluded to it earlier, but purple decks don't play honestly, if that kind of makes sense. They just hit Keats, they're going to Fate Emblem, get your Keats, and then just play the game a lot faster than you. You don't start ramping until turn 4. They're going to be ramping as early as turn 1. Generally by turn 2, though, at least. So you want to expect your turn 4 is probably going to line up with their turn 5, maybe turn 6. So you need to be running a lot more, like prioritizing dodges, I think, is a lot more important. Darkness Emblem always hurts these kind of decks early game. Like any kind of like slower deck is going to be not really liking the turn 1 Dark Emblem. That's also part of why running less Sigurd is good, because you don't require a turn 2 combo. Or a 2-card combo, sorry. You can just kind of like, if you get hit by a Dark Emblem, you say, shit, and pitch a Sigurd, and if you've got Nanna and Deirdre in your hand, you're doing alright. Zephiel is definitely a problem for the deck. Like, I'm not running Mirabilis. I had a hard time finding room for it. If you are concerned about running into Zephiel, maybe check out some Nino for Mirabilis, and just kind of hope that you cycle into it. You draw enough cards that it's maybe not that unrealistic to find the Mirabilis by the time you need it. But, you know, it's a deck that's weak to Zephiel. If it's not Zephiel MC, you're probably not that bad off. You just need to dodge early, and maybe use your tank up skill a little bit more aggressively than you normally would. Like, maybe if you've got, you know, 3 dodges in hand, use 2 of them to buff your MC a bunch, so that even if they do rip that last dodge out of your hand, Zephiel's still not going to be hitting you. So that might be the game plan there. There's definitely ways to beat it. Zephiel MC, again, that's a lot scarier, right? You can turn your dodges into not getting hit. Like, actually, maybe it's not that bad. If you just sort of say, like, all right, every single one of my dodges is going into my MC skill, and if I find myself with a dodge on your turn, I'm just going to use it early. Maybe that's fine. Maybe you honestly can get away with beating Zephiel for that reason. You still need to make sure that, like, you have Nino or something, like, you have a way to sort of get back, but this is sort of what I mean by, like, Lilina, this deck can play a lot more of, like, a hybrid game. Like, against Zephiel, you can dump all, like, your hand into your Lilina and just start swinging. Instead of playing towards the late game, you just say, all right, well, I've got, you know, no dodges in my hand, and I'm base 150, so you got to beat me in this race. Your weenies aren't hitting me, Zephiel's not hitting me, and you have no cards to snipe. So, you know, good luck, right? That, I think, seems pretty reasonable. That's a pretty good game plan. So, just by nature of Lilina's pretty aggressive skill set, you can 100% sort of lean into a more mid-range or even an aggressive playstyle. So yeah, definitely something to look towards. I think the general game plan with this deck is going to be play super slow, build up advantage in your hand, and then go for a Holy War. But if you need to, you know, turn on the gas and start swinging and blowing up your opponent, this deck can do it. This deck can definitely do it. Trying to think of what else there is to mention, and I think this about covers it. Feel free to, you know, copy the list, make some changes, and test it out yourself. If you know, find success with the list, if you make some changes that you think are helpful, let me know. I'm very curious to hear about it. And if you have any thoughts, you know, tag me. I'm in the Cipher Discord, and Plant Fan Club, right? So just, you know, reach out, make some, ask some questions, and I'm always happy to answer questions about the decks that I've built, or just, you know, talk about it. That's why I threw the video together, so, you know, reach out. I think that'll just about do it. This is the 50 card list I'm playing with the Lilina MC. I think this might just be this might be the way to play Lilina. Instead of leaning into, like, the dances and just going for that, build up advantage by just, you know, clearing board, drawing cards, and eventually winning the late game once you've got, like, that big tempo play with Holy War. Yeah, Set 22 helped out this list a lot with Sigurd and Leif, so hopefully more people get on this deck, and maybe we'll actually see a Lilina winning tournaments, unlike how people thought it was going to be back when she was released. All right, yeah, that's all I got. Take care, have a good one, and thanks for watching.